Hello, my name is Gehl and this is Cities for Everyone, the webinar. Every other Tuesday, I invite fascinating people from around the world to share experiences and knowledge that will help us create affordable, equitable, and sustainable cities. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, where as commissioner I led the design and construction of over 200 parks and took a small program called Ciclovia, Open Streets, and increased it to over 120 kilometers, 75 miles of car-free streets every Sunday and holiday, where more than 1 million people walk, bike, run, shop, enjoying the presence of each other. 17 years ago, I created 880 Cities, a non-profit organization based in Toronto, Canada, where I live. Last year, I ran for mayor and came second with 100,000 votes. My aim was to change the conversation in creating a Toronto for everyone. I've been fortunate to have worked in over 350 cities in all continents, sharing and learning. Based on all experiences, I develop master classes and keynotes customized to each city. But Cities for Everyone, the webinar, is a way of giving back. It's always free and hopefully always interesting. Please invite others to join us every other Tuesday, anyone who cares about cities and people, equity and sustainability, about all living older, healthier, and happier. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today we have hundreds of people, full house, from over 25 countries. Why? We have a fantastic guest, Helle Søholt. She's founding partner and CEO of Gehl Architects. She's going to be talking about cities for people. I've been friends with Helle for many, many years. She was very kind that invited me years ago to be on the board of advisors of the firm, and I was there for about 10 years. And we have also collaborated in different projects. And I have led missions of people to go and learn about Copenhagen, and I always engage with Helle and her amazing team at Gehl. Today, she's going to tell us through examples, through visuals, what is Gehl, what is Cities for People, and how can we really create cities that are healthier, cities that are equitable and sustainable. Helle, thanks for accepting the invitation. And let us know about Cities for People.
The very first beginning, we have had this mission or purpose, you could say, to make cities for people. And today we started out maybe as a more sort of advocacy, almost organization, wanting to change the paradigm of planning globally. But now we are actually even more focused on making change happen. Not just the mind shift change, but actually making change on ground. So we really focus on creating equitable, healthy, and sustainable people-first places for cities and communities alike. As Gehl mentioned, I started the company together with Jan Gehl now 23 years ago. I'm an urbanist myself. I trained actually as a building architect, and then afterwards as an urban designer. And I ran the company for the first 10 years together with Jan. And since then, for the last 13, I have been leading the company together with a partner group and an amazing team. Today, we're about 140 people across 3 offices. And we are also now part of the Curative, which is an ecosystem of companies that are collaborating around this human-centered approach to development. As mentioned, we are based in 3 amazing cities, but we do work globally. We have what we say an urban expertise, having worked across 300 different cities over the last 25 years. And we have a human-centric approach that I will tell you a little bit more about, where we collect empirical data to understand behavior and how people live as a way to sort of embed that into our strategies and design. And then we focus on delivering cities and communities that are thriving together, helping public sector and private sector clients use the public realm, connect with people locally as a platform for equity and sustainability development. We bridge a lot of different disciplines. When we started out over 20 years ago, we had a big base of architects in the company, but today we are a really cross-disciplinary office. We have social scientists, we have anthropologists, we have architects, landscape architects, people that work with public agencies and communications and so forth. So we really try to bridge disciplines by nature and focus on how people behave in cities, not just how they say they behave, but actually going out into the cities, observing, looking into what is the lived experience of people. And this image, as you can see, is just an example of how we can observe that a lot of times people are not necessarily acting or behaving in the way that we as designers had thought they would. And that's why it's so important to actually pay attention to. So the human-centered approach is really a people-focused approach. And to stay a little bit at the high level before we dive into projects, I think for a long time, up until COVID, even we also promoted this, you could say, way of working with having a strategic framework. And we tried to sort of create these shared visions amongst stakeholders and then developing strategies that could be implemented over several years. But I don't think this way of working works anymore. And it simply has to do with the speed of change, the issues that we are facing in so many cities. We now have climate change that is even more severe than it has been. We've just lived through the pandemic for the last 3 years. In Europe, we have war, we have inflation. So we have to work differently. We have to be even longer term focused, not just on having a shared vision, but actually what are the problems that we want to solve together? What are the SDGs, or what are the challenges that we are trying to actually create solutions for? And then we have to prototype our way and strategize rather than having a fixed strategy. We need to sort of perform active planning rather than having fixed plans. And this is actually a very different way of working. This is something that where we need politicians to be much more actively listening to people. We need to use data in new ways and so forth. So the way of working is rapidly changing, and we need to adapt to this agile process. So to say that with slightly different words, the Gehl approach is very much that we start with analysis and using sort of human-centric metrics. We engage people very early on and throughout the entire process. We have public space at the heart of everything we do in the office, and then try to really maximize the potential of mixed use and what we call human scale development in cities. And then we try to make it very iterative, as I showed on the other slide. So at Gehl, we help leaders make communities more equitable, healthy, and sustainable by using these human-centric insights. And I'm going to show you a couple of the tools that we use. So first of all, measuring public life has been a core piece of the way that we work from the very beginning. So that means actually measuring and monitoring, where do people walk? Where do they spend time? What do they do in the morning, in the evening, during winter or during summer? Where in the cities are they actually spending time? So that we actually know what is our baseline, how do we meet our communities right now before we start the planning and the strategizing and so forth. So we can use this data to inform our planning, and we can use it to monitor along this graph that I was showing before. How are we actually performing in terms of delivering on these long-term goals? Another digital tool of ours is the iLevel City app, where you can actually go out and take pictures of how the city is experienced. So not just the quantitative data that I showed in the other app, but also we've developed some tools that allows us to gather much more qualitative data on how people feel and where they feel welcome and where they feel a sense of belonging, for example. So I have a small film just to show you an example of how that played out in a project that we called Sense of Belonging.
The last years highlighted many social injustices. These magnified that cities work differently for various people and the need to interrogate how urban life is entangled with questions of power. We long for more diverse and nuanced insights into how the city works as a space of belonging, not from the professional eyes of those who design it, but from those who live in it. To this end, a collective of planners and researchers initiated the Urban Belonging Project as a quest to document the lived experience of underrepresented groups in Copenhagen. The Urban Belonging Project takes an alternative way to engage underrepresented communities. We engage participants who self-identify as deaf, LGBTQ+, homeless, internationals, ethnic minorities, people with physical disabilities, and people with mental vulnerabilities. First, we talked to their local representative organizations to let their insights about each group shape the project. Then, 33 participants were invited to show us the city from their perspective, using participatory photography and map making. With an app developed for this project, participants went on walks to take photos of situations and places that gave them a positive or negative sense of belonging. Over the course of 10 days, participants went on more than 100 walks and captured more than 1,400 photos of Copenhagen. They also filled out a spatial survey answering questions about their life in the city by drawing maps. Working collaboratively in workshops to interpret their own data, produce illustrations and narratives, we centered analytical and storytelling power in the participants. The result is a unique catalogue of photos, maps, data visualizations, and scenarios of the socially sustainable cities. The catalogue qualifies what belonging means to different people, maps geospatial patterns of where different marginalized identities have positive and negative experiences, opens conversations about how we experience the same places differently, and crafts an intersectional gaze on the cities. Now, we are working on turning insights into design principles, future scenarios, and a public exhibition about the socially sustainable city.
So this was just to show you a couple of the sort of digital tools that we are starting to use and how you can actually collect other types of data streams that you may not have thought about before, and how that can then influence your thinking about strategy and planning in a much more inclusive way. So these are giving us new possibilities, and I would say we have completely, I think, an opportunity globally right now on the back of COVID. I think there is an opportunity to engage people, being even more inclusive, using digital tools instead of only going out to physical meetings or engaging people in more traditional sense. So basically, we need a completely new approach to city management, but keeping it at this eye level so that we really understand people locally. So with that short introduction of our approach and our methodology and how we use data, I'm going to share 3 different projects that we have done globally. The first one, the Curative project, where we are delivering a local but very site-specific access to healthcare across the nation in the US. I'm going to share some images from an air quality work that we've done in Copenhagen, where we are transforming the public realm to improve air quality with a specific focus on children. And then I'm going to show how we have been engaged in the transformation of Market Street for a more sustainable future in San Francisco. So first, the Curative project. That was actually happening in the very, very first stages of COVID. And we also did a global COVID survey using some of the methods that I was talking about before. And what we saw was some of these results. City centers struggling, neighborhoods, though, increasing activity levels. To use Copenhagen, where I'm talking from as an example, we saw decreased activity levels in the city center by 80%, but an increase of activities at 35% out in every neighborhood. So public spaces and parks have become a necessary relief space, and they continue to be important also after COVID. Mobility behaviors have changed. We have seen many, many more pedestrians across all cities globally. Air quality improved drastically in the first months, but now we are more or less back to the old numbers. Physical distancing and new citizen skills, as I was talking about before, are still there, and we can use these new digital skills of ours to engage one another in different ways. And then we need to really address these physical inactivities, obesity, mental illnesses, and other things that have unfortunately increased during the pandemic. So having this in mind, we were approached by Curative, who essentially are developing this testing kit for COVID. And we were asked to think about how we can use play as an enabler for effortless healthy habits, engagement, and building trust locally, and to build more resilient communities. And the challenge we were meeting was these conditions, these places where you could only arrive for testing by car. So this image to your left here, this was the main sort of access point for most people across North America, I would say. So we tried to approach this problem from a very sort of design and user perspective, thinking about what is the physical experience that people have, what is the mental experience people have when coming to these areas, and what is even the social experience that people have, and how can we actually design that differently or think differently about this in order to make it more equitable and more inclusive. So we came up with the idea to build a mobile kiosk. So rather than people coming to the testing centers, we were bringing the testing center to people. And we could place these kiosks in the most vulnerable places where people don't have cars, and where people we could put it up in a local park, and people could, via an app, book a time for them to come and get tested. So we prototyped basically this kiosk and started looking at by zip code and by gaps in the testing infrastructure, and by looking at social vulnerability by census tract across the nation, we could start working and developing sort of a deployment priority score that was national. So these kiosks were delivered and set up in a lot of different places. We've improved the accessibility of the testing, but right now we have surpassed over 1 million locally distributed tests in the US across 30 cities over the past couple of years. So we are now trying to take these ideas even to the next level and think about how can we combine even more uses, not only testing, but how can we actually address people's needs in a more complete, localized, place-based healthcare solution. Another example of our work is the air quality work in Copenhagen, and that's also an example of how to use data to influence our strategizing. Here, the problem was related to the fact that 90% of children's brain is developed before they are 5 years old. And yet small children in urban areas, they breathe actually 4 times as fast as an adult, resulting in an inhalation of 4 times as much polluted air because of their heights and everything. So we wanted to explore gathering big data sets on air pollution. We partnered up with Google and their Google Street View cars that has a filter that can actually map the particles at a very, very sort of person height level in all the streets of Copenhagen. So Google helped us gather much more fine-grained air pollution data than the city had ever had. And then we paired that with actually the Gehl data, going out looking into where do small children actually spend time with their caregivers, with their kindergartens, with their families and so forth, where are the playgrounds in the city and so forth. And then pairing these data sets up in a way so that we could actually look at where to solve the problems, where are the problems most severe, and how can we actually develop this more action-oriented planning. So on the basis of these data sets, we've helped develop these, you could say, public space action plans, as you see on your left, with an overarching sort of network of streets and how they could be prioritized, where we could reposition playgrounds and equipment. Also to your right, how to actually be greening some of the cities or city streets by adding more trees and having more services in the center of streets rather than on street corners and things like that. This project is actually connected to, you could say, the whole history of Copenhagen's development, because Copenhagen has worked with data and this transformation for many, many years. This is a picture from the 1930s of Copenhagen Harbor that was completely industrialized. And this is a picture of how Copenhagen looks today, a much more densely built out waterfront with new city districts. It's a green city, but it's also a blue city where the harbor has now been transformed into a place of leisure. You can actually now go swimming along the harbor. You can bicycle and you can walk along the whole harbor. This was based on a plan that we did more than 20 years ago, where we decided that you have to be able to walk and cycle along the whole harbor. And only a couple of years ago, it actually opened up. So this also tells you how long it actually takes to transform urban areas. I think the blue plan was one of the first plans that we did as an office about 20 years ago. So it is really about not just creating physical places, it's about creating culture. It's about changing the way that we feel or think that we can live our lives. In Copenhagen, nobody thought that we would have a cafe culture back in the 60s or 70s. Nobody thought that we would ever, 20 years ago, be able to necessarily swim in Copenhagen Harbor. So how do we imagine for these long-term solutions and then systematically build for change? This is our job. I think all of us on this call, how do we see for us that we can work in these incremental stages, constantly having that vision or having that long-term problem that we need to solve in mind, and then do it one project at a time. The last project that we are engaged in right now in the city center of Copenhagen is this city stretch street section leading from the central station down to the town hall square, where we are looking into maybe pedestrianizing this zone right in front of Tivoli Gardens and making this part an even more green and accessible place. We often talk about this not as we are not closing the street for cars, we are opening it up for people. And then the last project I'm going to share is Better Market Street. And this might be in some ways more traditional, you could say, but on the other hand, the process has not necessarily been so traditional, because we started out very much as with analyzing the street and looking into how communities are using the street and how it connects all the way from the capital to Fisherman's Wharf. But then we had a long process while waiting for the environmental assessment and everything. We had a long prototyping festival that took place over several years. And this was amazing opportunity for politicians and decision makers and so forth to actually come down to the street, engage in ping pong and understanding how the street was actually being used and could be used potentially by local communities before we then scaled up what seemed to be working. So we prototyped over 50 different ideas over these years and had lots of visitors and engagement through these types of activities. So the outcomes were really sort of generously elevated cycle tracks. We created these street life zones and areas for sidewalks that were devoted to engagement, safety and increased public life. And then, of course, very importantly, the local partnerships that were going to make this happen on a continuous basis. So this is an image of how the Market Street corridor has been transformed into this much more green, much more generous gesture throughout the whole city. And it has become a cultural connector as well as a mobility connector, you can say, throughout the entire city. So finishing off my presentation here, I think, as you can see, we have always been very laser focused on making impact and change that matters for people, having this focus on public spaces for everyone. But even in that focus, you can say, we are constantly learning and elaborating. You could say early on, there was maybe a focus on just space, actually space that would accommodate for many different uses. But then in later generations, we started focusing less on just providing space, but then how do we create place? And then there was a transition from not just thinking about squares and meeting places and gathering places for everyone, but also how do we transform everyday streets? How do we include bicycling? How do we include public transportation? How do we make streets for everyone that connects with community? And then I think we've been through a phase of thinking a lot about how can we move from just thinking about passive activities and recreation in cities to active engagement of cities and active lifestyles and active playgrounds and all of these different things. All the way up to now, where I think much of our work now is doing all of these different stages historically, but also now really trying to add that last layer of focus on health, focus on inclusion. So we are essentially adding, you could say, trying to connect public life and the way we live in cities to public spaces and as a democratic access point for all people, and then connect that to something as broad as the UN SDGs, trying to help cities and authorities and governments and so forth to comply with these ambitions of long-term systemic change and living in a much more sustainable world. And just to finish up with one last image for how that might look, we were engaged in the transformation of Shanghai waterfront, and this is an image of how it looked just before the pandemic in 2018. The waterfront was inaccessible. You could see even the buildings were disconnected from the waterfront itself. It felt relatively unsafe, especially during night. And this is how the waterfront has now been transformed. 42 kilometers of pedestrian space have been created on the basis of our strategies, providing accessible public space for almost 5 million people in walking distance. And this is as much as we have people in Denmark, where I'm speaking from. So this is just showing how much of an impact these types of projects can have on people's everyday life in cities, and why it is so important for us to think holistically about change, so that we think about energy, spaces, buildings, but first and foremost of the people who are living it every day. So with that, I'll unshare, and really just looking forward to your questions.
Helle, thank you very much. What an amazing session. All of the examples, all of the images, the wealth of knowledge that you have provided us, not only knowledge, but practical, useful, so that the people that are on these webinars, I see them as champions. I see everyone as a passionate advocate for cities for everyone. People have been able to hear and see examples on why your presentation was called Cities for People, and for all people, young and old, rich and poor, about equity and about sustainability. And I love that you are opinionated, because we need planners to be opinionated about doing cities that are sustainable. And you say cities cannot take 40 years. Maybe Copenhagen was done over 40 years. No, now we need what Copenhagen did in 40, but take out the 0, we need to do it in 4. Climate change and the crisis are too big not to change now. Helle, thank you very, very much. It has been fantastic, very enjoyable. I hope that everybody had a wonderful time, and I hope to see you soon. And for everybody, please share the recording with your decision makers, elected officials, other staff. And Helle and everyone, you are invited to the next session. And all the best, Helle, and congratulations for what you have led as CEO, as main partner of Gehl Architects over many years, transforming cities around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you all for listening.